Hey everybody, this is Matthew Pose of Pose Acoustics. We're doing Q&A, and I'm just going to go down to the list and ask the next one. So, Stevo19801 says, as OLED and LCD screens are getting ever closer to projector size, I think there will be more and more people building theaters in the future with these. What would you have done for LCR placement in these setups? Priscilla seems to be going above screen, but what's your opinion? I've actually answered this a bunch of times and it created some controversy. So I'm just going to say your mileage may vary. You may have your own beliefs. I believe strongly that my views are right, but you don't have to agree with me. So, first off, as of today, my experience and those of my partners that I work with is that micro LED, LCD, and OLED of that larger size has some trade-offs, compromises to projectors, such that I don't consider an automatic win in every regard. The biggest one is sound, and that's pretty obvious. You can't place speakers behind the screen. And the mechanisms by which you can turn the screen into a speaker, like Sony's method using exciters, the fidelity and SPL levels are very, very poor, so that's not there yet. Now, having said that, I think there's some others. So what we found is that it can get pretty tricky to optimize these screens in a dark theater room to give that same cinematic look that you're used to seeing in a commercial cinema. Now, it could be, just like as an example, 120 frames per second actually looks much better than 24 frames per second. It doesn't look cinematic, and it doesn't look right for movies. But in terms of realism, it looks much better. So I refer to it as being hyper real. It's not really, it's actually like real versus the cinema look, which is very artificial. I mean, it's jarring, there's jumping between, there's judder, so there's like this jumping between frames that you see. It's what we're used to seeing, and it's what's become known as that cinematic look. And the same thing is true of other aspects of it. Projectors just have a certain look to them that we're used to in a theater that OLEDs, for instance, don't have. So there's certain things they do better that I don't think takes away from the cinematic look, like the contrast ratio, the better blacks, the highlights being better, all that. The sharpness, I mean, you can get pretty sharp looking pictures from especially DLP projectors these days, but I do think it's a little bit better on those displays. But there's something about the way it handles color and smoothness and the movement of images that looks probably more real, but actually looks a little bit less cinematic. So one takeaway would be it just has that less cinematic look to it. They typically are way too bright. And even though they're technically more correct for HDR content, there's a lot of people who seem to agree with me that it doesn't look right in a light-controlled, dedicated theater environment unless you really take the brightness down, and it takes a lot of work because often they don't have a cinema-optimized mode that's dark enough. So they're still pretty bright. So those would be some of the things that I would kind of say. Then what I would also say is with micro LEDs, the contrast is still not there. What they do, everybody's like, oh, no, it's the same as OLED. It's not. OLEDs can go from black to just above black to just above that in very smooth gradations, but micro LEDs cannot. And so what happens is they go from black and then they go through the next set of gradations without the LEDs turning on at all. So they're still black. And then it hits a certain point and it turns on, and it's way higher. So what happens is when images have a lot of gradation between pitch black and something that isn't pitch black, what you see are more like blocks of light. It's very jarring, the differences, and it doesn't look right. And when it does come from black out of black, it jumps. So there's two solutions. One would be to fix that, and they haven't really done that yet. I'm sure it's possible. It's just going to be a matter of fine-tuning the way that the LEDs are driven. But that hasn't happened correctly yet. And the other solution is you just don't let them turn off. Whatever is the darkest they can go before they turn off is what you set as the limit. And when it gets that signal, that's where they're at. And the problem then is the contrast of these are only about 5,000 to 1. So now all of a sudden, the only benefit over a projector is not contrast anymore. It's not really sharpness. It's brightness. And you can get 108 nits, which is what Dolby Vision projector standard is, and that's what you would see in any commercial cinema, and it's what's used when they're evaluating movies in the dubs, in like a dubbing room, mix down room or dub stage, something like that. Not dubbing room, dub stage. So, okay, to actually answer your question though around sound, I am not a fan of placing the speakers above or below. I don't think that sounds as good. I know there's some companies doing that, and there are some solutions like one from Ascendo that I'd like to hear before I judge. I've not heard that one yet, but I have heard other solutions that I was not a fan of. I did not think that they sounded right. And I did play with this quite a bit. So we had a project where we ended up going with a projector because the client ultimately agreed with our assessments when we gave them demos. But we thought we were going to have to go down the road of like a big 200 plus inch wide micro LED screen or direct view LED screen. And so what we would have had room for was a left and a right speaker that would have been on either side of the screen. It would have been a little too close to the wall, and I didn't love that, but we could have done that. So we were going to kind of have these angled panels on the front that go into the TV, and the speakers would have been aimed in. And then the thought was, well, we'll put a center above and below it because we actually had enough height to do that for this given size screen. So we played with that in like a warehouse space where a model TV was set up. And to me, when I was sitting at a distance of about, I think it was like 18 feet maybe from it, that even though there was a center above and below, all I really heard was that center below, and the voices sounded like they were coming from there. And in this case, so in the theater we were building, I think there was 17. There was 17 inches of height between the bottom of the screen and the floor. And the one that I was playing with, it was even less than that. And your ears are probably closer to 40 inches. 30 to 40 inches is pretty normal range for typical chairs. And in this theater, we would have been doing that first row actually was up on a small riser, so it would have been even higher yet. And so the model I used was probably pretty close to what we would have had. And that bottom center channel dominated my perception. That's where the voices sounded like, and I just could not get that out of my head. And that has also been my experience in general with having a center channel under a TV, is that it doesn't sound like the voices are coming from the picture exactly. It really kind of sounds like it's coming from the center. For the center channel, so below the TV. So we tried remixing the two and had a lot of trouble. And then I read about how Harman was doing something with a darkening filter and their approach. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. I'd be kind of curious to try that. Let me see if I can make that work. So I applied a darkening filter to the top center channel and played a bit more around with its time alignment and everything and tried to optimize it. And it made a big difference, and that was better. But then I had also been reading about what Meyer Sound had been doing with the reflex system, which is reflecting it off of there. And I thought, oh, that's interesting too. So I actually took a speaker and I placed it so that it was aimed at the screen and was reflecting off of it. And I thought, that's impressive. But the effect seemed to really depend on where I was sitting. So then I started playing around with the crossover point, and I raised the crossover point. And then I also played with the same concept with Anthony Grimani at CEDIA last year because we were going to demo it. We had some issues with it, which is a side issue, but the actual effect we were able to get to be very, very good as long as you were sitting behind the speaker and the crossover point was high enough. And then what you do is you blend everything below that. So with his system specifically, if you cross it at, roughly speaking, let's say 1 kilohertz, and then you feed that other signal out to like a bass speaker that's at the screen or to the left and the right speakers, the reflected sound has to get all time aligned, and that's tricky to do. There's a lot of processing involved in this. There's a lot of work. You have to know what you're doing. You have to use precise measurements. But once you get it all right, that reflected sound off the screen comes back to you. Sounds like it's coming right off the center channel. And as long as the speaker that you're using to reflect has the right dispersion pattern, which needs to be relatively narrow, once you remember, the inverse square law is in effect here. So when it hits the screen, if everything has been accounted for correctly, you can match the directivity off the reflection from the screen to your left and your right speakers and get a very cohesive sound. So this is what we've been playing with. And in my opinion, this is the future. This is a much better effect. And I think it can actually be done in small residential spaces with a speaker mounted in the ceiling that's like a normal in-ceiling speaker, but just a special optimization to its dispersion and angle, and could even be used in things like 65-inch TVs without issue. So to me, this is a direction we need to play with more. I would love to see some processing built in to handle this in receivers and shut-off processors and storm processors, et cetera. They kind of have it, but not exactly. There's some routing issues that they don't handle that So we've been using external DSP to do it, but they handle most of it, and you could probably make it work at least okay with what it has built in. So this is the direction I see us going. I'd like to do more. I think Anthony's got, to me, the most residential friendly version of this. So I think the Grimani Systems reflective system is probably where it's at for now. But I think there's other ways to do it, and I want to play with it to kind of get more options, because I like his and I like Anthony. But I think there's nothing wrong with competition, and I think there's nothing wrong with more options for more scenarios, because sometimes you have scenarios where a certain approach won't work, including maybe cost, maybe it's too expensive. Excuse me. So if there's a potentially cheaper solution that's maybe not as good, but pretty good, that could be pretty awesome. I mean, imagine if we had properly angled, properly, precisely done dispersion speakers, and all left, center, and right are mounted in the ceiling, but they're reflecting off the wall, and that's what you hear. And on the front wall, we have maybe something else that you don't see, but it's handling everything below a certain frequency range. You could get a really, really high performance theater in a space that you'd never really see. And it's totally doable. So that's what I've tried. That's where it's at. Not a huge fan of the above and below approach. It's okay. It's better than nothing, but it kind of falls into this. It's like nothing might actually be just having a left and a right speaker. And in some cases, phantom center is pretty good, you know? So, maybe that's a better approach. So I hope that was helpful. Again, I know these videos are kind of long explanations of this stuff. Hopefully you guys are understanding why and enjoying this. I got more questions to answer here, so I'll keep going. Thank you.